All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We were experiencing a few technical glitches as we were trying to get things started here. And so we've got a couple of workarounds, and hopefully this goes as according to plan. In any case, thank you very much for being here. We've got students in Government 319, that is my perspectives on the 2020 election class. And we are proud to be sharing our space today with the Global Islamic Center, the Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University, who is co-hosting our special guest lecture today with Dr. Hussein Rashid. I'm going to provide a brief introduction of Dr. Rashid, and then he's got a presentation for us. I think it'll probably work best if you hold your questions to the end of the presentation. I'll try to do a little bit of interviewer Q&A with him, but certainly whether you are a member of the community or a member of my class, please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll see how many of them we can get through between now and 2:30. And I also want to remind everybody attending that we are recording this session, and it will be posted both on my website for my students in our class on our Blackboard page, and also on the website page for the Islamic Studies Center at George Mason University. All right, so thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Rashid. I'm absolutely thrilled that you agreed to join us and to have this expanded audience to share your thoughts on where we are. Dr. Hussein Rashid labels himself a freelance academic, but he's associated with a number of universities in New York City. His expertise and scholarship focuses on Muslims in US and popular culture related to Muslim Americans and Muslim religion. He's also the founder of Islamicate, an L3C consultancy organization that focuses on religious literacy and cultural competency. He is currently co-editing a volume on Islam and popular culture and another volume on Islam in North America. He is also working on a cultural history of Muslims in the United States. He's a very busy guy. His current projects include independent films, a documentary, museum projects having to do with religion and jazz, really a truly multifaceted with many interests, multi-talented kind of scholar. Here to share with us his thoughts today, where he's going to talk with us about the elections and politics, looking at Muslims and race and class in the United States. And I'm just very thrilled to welcome you today. So thank you for being with us, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Professor Victor, and thank you for having me in your class and for the Center for inviting me and arranging this connection as well. I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity. So we have a short amount of time today, and I've bitten off a lot to cover in the next 20 to 25 minutes, which is talking about making the U.S. Muslims, race, and class. And part of this talk is going to cover, or the way I've tried to structure this talk is to break it up into three different sections. Is one, begin by looking at the founding of the nation. What happens in the early period as we're talking about the formation of the United States, and really what role do race and religion play in that early period. Then I'll jump ahead from the 18th century into the early 20th century and look at conditional citizenship. It may seem that citizenship is something one possesses or one doesn't, but in fact, how one has citizenship in the United States is something that has been deeply contested. So I'll look at a couple of case studies in the early 20th century that are relevant for the conversation for us today. And then I'll move into the 21st century and the 2020 election. So basically into last week. So we're only going to be covering about 280 years today in 20 minutes. So this should be, more than manageable for all of us across the board. Please do, as questions come up, do throw them in the chat. I don't think I will be able to see them and address them to the best of my ability during the presentation, but I would like to make sure that everything is clear to the best of my ability at the end of the presentation. So let's start by talking about the founding of the nation. And here the nation, I mean the United States of America. When we look at the founding of the nation, we tend to look at certain keystone moments, figures, and documents. And here, for our purposes, I really want to start by looking at a document. And probably one of the most well-known phrases from the founding documents of the United States is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This is from the United States Declaration of Independence. Now, as attentive readers, we begin to ask questions. What is self-evident in this? Is everybody guaranteed equality or equity in this? The short answer is obviously no. We start, the very phrase itself begins by defining men. So gender becomes part of the equation. Who is considered, what is self-evident about these truths that have, who has inalienable rights? And women are written out of that. So we start looking at men. And then we have to start asking which men. And as we start asking which men, there is, of course, a very clear statement between the Declaration and the Constitution that it is white men who are being discussed. And is it really just about race? No, we also find out that it's landowners. So there's a class element in here. So the people who have inalienable rights, according to the founding documents of this nation, are tied intimately to questions of race, class, and gender. So what does that mean? This is what is self-evident out of the document. Again, as attentive readers, we're discovering this. This is very much in line with the Enlightenment thinkers of the time, who people like Thomas Jefferson, coming to a founding figure, are looking at for inspiration. Right? It is very much a feature, not a bug, that it is about reinforcing, these documents are about reinforcing power structures that exist already and transferring them in a new way, but through a more neutral language. What is not self-evident in this statement, all men are created equal, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, are questions of religion and sexuality. And while sexuality, much like gender, is too much to cover in our scope today, it is important to think about how does our discourse today in the United States around questions of sexuality and sexual identity, how is that inflected by the ways in which we conceive of who's an American at the founding of the nation? Because we cannot say that there is a rupture between today and then. Rather, we have to say, what is it that happened then that is informing what is happening today? On the question of religion, and this is really where I want to spend a little bit of time about the founding of the nation, is what can we surmise? And I would propose that, in fact, we can surmise that to be a citizen is not only gendered, classed, and raced, but is also religioned. That there is a presumption of a Protestant Christian identity in terms of who would own citizenship in this country. Now, in terms of the Catholic Protestant divide, again, a little bit outside of what it is we are capable of doing within our time. But do recognize that, at least in the early period, Catholics were considered a Christianity that was not necessarily part of the popular imagination when it came to the founding of the nation. And so let's turn specifically, for the purposes of this talk, to questions of Muslims and the founding of the nation. And here we can talk about Muslims both real and imagined. And for me, this is very important because when we look at the founding of the country, there are very real Muslims in the United States and there are imagined Muslims in the United States. And what I mean by imagined Muslims are Muslims that what are the people who are collectively known as the founding fathers are imagining Muslims to be, who they think collectively Muslims are. And one of the things that theorists around identity talk about is that when you define a group of others, when you define the other, that group of others, what you're actually doing is defining yourself. So if you say the other person is X, what you're saying is you are not X, the self is not X. So when we look at this question of Muslims, real and imagined, is really about trying to figure out what does it mean to say I am a citizen of the United States and imagining yourselves against Muslims. And so this is the argument I want to make today. So when we look at the founders, again, we can look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who believed religious freedom should include, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, an archaic form of referring to Muslims. Or James Iredell, at a constitutional convention, said approvingly, the people of America may perhaps choose representatives who have no religion at all, and that pagans and Mohammedans may be admitted into offices. And so we can look at these statements in divorced from their context and say Jefferson and Iredell are arguing for a very expansive notion of religious freedom. That there should be no religious litmus test for office holding in the United States, that religion is irrelevant for office holding in the United States, and therefore we can work backwards and say Therefore, religious identification is irrelevant to questions of citizenship in the United States, right? Because you can only be an office holder if you're a citizen. So we can work backwards through an implicit connection. However, I would argue that when we look at these in context and really looking at the work of somebody like Denise Spellberg and her work Jefferson's Quran, that what somebody like Jefferson is doing here is not trying to generate an inclusive sense of Muslims in the US body politic, but rather saying that Muslims are so foreign to the concept of what I know of and what I understand that they become the imagined litmus test, right? We want to be so progressive that we would allow Muslims to hold office, but we could never conceive of that actually happening, right? So Muslims become an imaginary figure, a rhetorical trope to indicate this level of openness without necessarily the structures or the consideration for how that would look like in practice. Now, where do I get this sense from? Why do I make this argument? Well, at the same time, Jefferson is saying that Muslims should be able to hold office in this country, he is, of course, also actively disenfranchising the largest group of Muslims in the United States at the time, who are the enslaved peoples, right? About 10 to 12% of enslaved peoples in the United States at this time were Muslim. And so Jefferson is saying, well, hey, let's talk about citizenship for Muslims. He is talking about these imagined Muslims, not the real Muslims, some of whom he may very well have been keeping enslaved himself, as having access to that citizenship. So we see an intersection between race and religion, but also that Jefferson is not considering the people who are physically in front of him who are Muslim and thinking about their quest for citizenship or their access to levels of citizenship. And so we can talk about historical figures like Yaro Mahmoud, whose portrait you see here, the first American Muslim to have a portrait that we are aware of. Job Ben Solomon, known also as Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who has one of the earliest Muslim autobiographies. Omar ibn Said, who also has an early autobiography. Or the Bilali brothers, who are scholars who we have work that they wrote about legal traditions from their parts of West Africa. So it is not that we are imagining Muslims at this time period. It is that Jefferson is ignoring the real Muslims in favor of his imagined Muslim identity in order to talk about how, in fact, inclusive he is, without actually getting into the question of what does that look like in practice. So we see, again, the relationship between race and religion and the imagination of what it means to be Muslim rather than the reality of what it means to be Muslim, that somebody like uh, uh, Jefferson had access to. So now I want to jump ahead to the early 20th century and look at questions of conditional citizenship. What does conditional citizenship mean? What I want to do is I want to look at two very specific cases, both from the 1920s. The first is the Ozawa case, 1922. And in this case, a Japanese man came forward and said, I am a free white man because I am not black, and therefore I should be granted citizenship to the United States. Because at this point, citizenship was limited to free white men and people of African descent. So here the judge rules the words white person were meant to indicate only a person of what is popularly known as the Caucasian race. So that there is a scientism, sorry, I'm blanking on the word. It's not scientific, but there's this idea that you use the language of science to justify particular policies. Collectively, it's known as scientism. So, this judge is using that language, that there's this idea of what a Caucasian race is. You don't belong to that. So when we say white person, we're really talking about Caucasian race. You're not a Caucasian. Therefore, you are not allowed access to citizenship. So then a year later, we get the 10th case. And the 10th case is about a man from Punjab in South Asia who comes forward and says, I am an Aryan. I am the very definition of a Caucasian. When you look scientifically at who Caucasians are, you are categorically looking at my people. And the judge turns around and says, well, yes, you may be scientifically Caucasian, but it's not what we mean by whiteness in a common understanding, right? So what we see here is this dynamic element of trying to limit who is allowed citizenship, who is white in this context, and those definitions change from a scientism understanding to a common or popular understanding that are often divorced and unlinked from each other. So from these cases, what we learn is that whiteness is constructed, that whiteness is malleable, whiteness is aspirational for marginalized groups, and whiteness is often defined against blackness. And here I'll take just a brief sideline that what I mean here is that when we look at, for example, Irish citizens who were Irish immigrants who were Catholic, or Italian immigrants who were Catholic, or German immigrants who were Catholic, that, and again, I'm making a point here, that they were considered not quite white. And the ways in which they achieved success and acceptance into whiteness as a category of belonging and citizenship was through economic success and the normalization of Catholicism in American discourse vis-a-vis other religious groupings. So that you could be poor Irish in one generation, but if you become middle class, if you have access to that capital, literal capital, then that also buys you social capital that allows you access to those quarters of whiteness and allows you to divine yourself against blackness in this country. So that whiteness is something aspirational as part of a power structure, and it is also phenotypic, that is on your appearance, and it is also connected to questions of religion. So here again, that Protestant Catholic question comes into play. And whiteness is used to define citizenship both legally and culturally. So legally, we see in these Supreme Court cases that what we understood as whiteness is what allows access to questions of citizenship. How white you are is the ways in which you are allowed to be a citizen. Right now, theoretically, some of that goes away, but often, who gets told go back to where you came from? People who are not white, even though they may be Native American. This is what I mean by culturally, whiteness is used to define citizenship. That there is a question of who is truly a member of the United States and who belongs. So keep these things in mind, this idea of conditional citizenship and the relationship to whiteness. And again, whiteness is not, here I'm using it not as a phenotypic or racial category, although that is an important component, but really as a power category, because it is something that people can fall into and, as we can see, can come out of. So what does this mean for the 2020 election? So when we look at the 2020 election, I want to show you this chart. This is from a recent article from NPR on November 3rd called Understanding the 2020 Electorate AP Votecast Survey. And if you look here, Muslims represent less than 1% of the share of voters. They voted 64% for Biden and 35% for Trump. Now, the question is, this president has been criticized, the current president, President Trump, has been criticized roundly for instituting what has become popularly known as the Muslim ban. A ban initially against 7 countries, with several other countries being added on over time. So why would a Muslim population vote for an individual, by almost a third of the population, vote for a president who constantly demeans and demonizes the community and not only rhetorically attacks the community, but also legally attacks the community by virtue of their religion? Now, before I move further and dig a little bit into this data, Mehta Hassan, who is an anthropologist and researcher, pointed out that this data is based on exit day polls. In other words, this isn't an overall survey, this is based on exit day polls. And this particular cycle, the actual day of voting, it tended to skew much more Republican than the entire voting period because many more Democrats voted absentee or voted by mail. So that we can assume that there is probably a bit of a Republican bias in this sample, but I haven't seen enough of the cross data to see how much of that bias would be yet. That might be something that you find on your own, but I haven't seen that data yet. So just I want to put that caveat out. out there, and credit Mehta Al Hassan for pointing that out. So if we look at how Muslims vote, probably one of the best sources of data for American Muslim voting patterns is data and polling put out by ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And this is from a report they put out in the middle end of October. The link is here. I will share it with Professor Victor to share with you as well. And it is American Muslim Poll 2020 is what it's called if you want to look it up on your own. And so what they did was they said, okay, what are the categories or what are the similarities between the American Muslim population and the general public that might want to make, what are the common characteristics that indicate that they would vote for Trump? So we see here that identifying as Republican is a common theme. That makes sense, right? Party affiliation seems to be probably one of the most important indicators for how somebody's going to vote in recent election cycles. So there seems to be a commonsensical aspect to that, if you will. But here's some interesting pullouts. Opposition to faith group building coalitions with Black Lives Matter, right? So here we see sort of a sense that there is a grievance against recognizing all people should be treated legally equally, right? That forms into the identity politics of Republican group formation. So by the Republican group formation is dependent on negating the legal rights of black people. So we see that, and then again, we see the connection then with faith and the opposition to equal rights for all people in this country. Support for faith group building coalitions with political conservatives on religious liberty issues. Now, religious liberty is an interesting code word. And I don't want to get into the ISPU side of this. I think reading the report in full is worth getting into. However, usually when we talk about political conservatism and religious liberty, it is one of these Orwellian doublespeak issues, in my opinion. Because what they mean by religious liberty is the enforcement of particular Christian understandings of religion that are then applied to other groups of people. So, for example, religious liberty means denying people the right to abortion, regardless of what their own religious tradition says about abortion, that it is important that in order for this group of people to exercise their religion, other people must be denied their practice of religion. Or, for example, healthcare, right? There are very clear commandments in various faith traditions that people should be given whatever support they need to care for their body. Many people read that as interpret that to mean that that implies universal health care. But what the religious liberty crowd would argue is that no, in fact, religious liberty means my ability to practice my religion that makes sure nobody else has access to health care. Right? So I think the religious liberty, the idea of religious liberty is a bit Orwellian here. And then economy is the most important policy priority for judging a candidate. So again, here we see questions of class coming into play, because oftentimes in this election cycle, presidential election cycle, we have seen the stock market as being used as a synonym for how well the economy is doing, when in fact we know that the stock market is often divorced from the economy experienced by the majority of people in this world. The economy is usually better judged by people's discretionary income, minimum wages, housing prices, and cost of living. So that the class issue relates to the Wall Street as opposed to how most people are living, where the economy looks very, very different. I'm going to skip some of this data on income because we don't have a comparison, and then coming to the demographics. Identifying as white crosses over from the general public and being Muslim. That identifying as white is an important predictor whether you will vote for Trump or not. And here's what I find absolutely fascinating in this survey is that there is a correlation between having higher Islamophobia, that is, as a Muslim endorsing anti-Muslim tropes and voting for Trump, as there is in the general public. In other words, being Muslim does not prevent you from identifying with Islamophobic tropes and anti-Muslim tropes and anti-Muslim actions, right? And so this is an important takeaway for me, in that there is not an insulating factor as to being Muslim with respect to the question of religion. So race is not a defining factor any more than religion is. However, there are certain predictive factors here. And we have to remember demographically, if we go back to the NPR poll, it says on election day, 35% of Muslims said they voted for Donald Trump. Yet, white Muslims make up roughly 1% of the American Muslim population. So, therefore, we see that race is not the determining factor here when it comes to voting for Biden in the religious category. So, we have to then start speculating as to where this is coming from. So, for me, these are the takeaways out of this polling is that race is an influential factor, but not a determining factor. Money whitens, right? We see the ways in which class, the economy, then becomes a predictor, and Muslims are imagining themselves as in the nation as it is, not as it could be. So they are seeing themselves not as a figure like Yaro Mahmoud, but the ambassador Meli Meli, who was the ambassador who Thomas Jefferson first hosted the first iftar, the first Ramadan breakfast in the White House that Thomas Jefferson hosted was for this Tunisian ambassador. They imagine themselves as Ambassador Meli Meli, the upper class ambassador who's greeted at the White House, not the Yaro Mahmoud who is enslaved by oppressive structures. And so these are the class of Muslims who are somewhere in there voting for class interests, voting to imagine themselves as part of the centers of power, who imagine themselves as proximate to whiteness or seeking entry into whiteness. And again, we see the intersection then, I would argue, um, of race and religion in all these categories. And so, what are the implications here? The implications, from my perspective, are that these social reinforcing these social hierarchies, which many of these electors voting not in full awareness, or perhaps in full awareness and consciously voting for these hierarchies, but voting, I'm assuming, in the sense that does not understand the power dynamics of this country in full uh, or explicitly, that reinforcing the social hierarchies are harmful and they cause real harm, both in terms of people's wages, interactions with law enforcement, access to health care, and potential harm. And by potential harm, I mean what could happen. And this is where we come back to conditional citizenship. When Donald Trump first came into office, in addition to the Muslim ban, one of the things that he talked about was DACA and the Dreamers program. Related to that was talking about what access green card holders had, right? So these are not full US citizens, but these are recognized residents of the United States. What rights green card holders had within the context of the United States. Now, generally, green card holders are afforded full rights of citizenship within the context of the United States. There are some exceptions, but generally we treat green card holders as full citizens. And what Donald Trump was suggesting, President Trump was suggesting, was that we roll back some of those rights. Now, for those of us who are aware of this history, this sounds very familiar. This is about how do you start chipping away at citizenship. First, you take away the near citizenship category, that is green card holders, full residents. Then you start taking away the rights of naturalized citizens, which was very much part of the rhetoric that Donald Trump was using. Then you start going after birthright citizenship, which again was an important point that if you were born of parents who were not uh, 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 born American citizens, then your citizenship was not full citizenship. Now, when we start hearing this question of legal votes, right, we should only count the legal votes. Those of us who've been careful students of how citizenship has been constructed in this country are very nervous because who are the people who are allowed to legally cast votes in an originalist reading of the Constitution? Are the white male landowners, right? This is why, now this may sound a bit alarmist, and I'm not sure it'll happen this time, but you are setting very important legal precedent in some of these lawsuits that go back to the founding of this country. You harken back to the question of who is a citizen, who is not access to citizenship, and how do you determine who is a citizenship? And this is where questions of originalist readings, rather than the interpretive process and the growth of law and the growth of society that has happened over time through the Constitution, become problematic and dangerous. And here, I think when we look at the role Muslims are playing in their current vote, it is partaking in these power structures. Now, again, I haven't seen enough raw data to know how this breaks out across race lines within the American Muslim community, aside from the ISPU data on questions of whiteness and leaning towards Donald Trump. However, I feel very confident in saying that you will find most of the people who voted for Donald Trump will be predominantly, after whiteness, will be predominantly immigrants, will be predominantly people who are middle class, probably upper middle class and higher, people who are aspiring to that question of whiteness, and most likely South Asians and Arabs, mostly because they have the longest history within this country of sociologically of attempting to fit into these patterns of assimilation to whiteness over questions of integrating and mobilizing for broader and more equal rights for other people. So these are just some of my observations on the election, but why it causes concern for me, going back historically as to who defines the nation and how the nation is defined with respect to questions of citizenship. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Victor in Q&A, if that's all right.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. You've really given us a lot to think about. And you touched on a lot of themes that my students and I have been reading about and talking about in our class so far this semester. So I think there's a lot of threads we could pull on here, a lot of points of commonality that we could point to. So I want to invite students and participants to leave questions in the chat. I have some questions of my own that I want to offer Dr. Rashid, and I want to make sure that students and members of the community here at the center's invitation also have an opportunity to ask questions. So please just use the chat either in a public way, or you can private chat questions to me as well. If that makes you feel more secure, then I'd be happy to repeat those. It's hard to, I had a whole question in mind that I thought I might pose to you at first. And now I'm even before going there going to go off the rails, because apparently in the amount of time that apparently just before this class started this afternoon, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has had a press conference in which he publicly said that he believed there would be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. So we are seeing an increasing amount of rhetoric from these Republican not just elected leaders, but cabinet officials. Secretary of State is obviously a very important position in the government, that are not recognizing the election outcome and continue to make claims of fraud without evidence, which appears to be a destabilizing tactic. So help us process this. Help us think about the idea of undermining faith in the election process, in the idea of free and fair elections with respect to these themes that you've raised about race and identity, and who is, this whole idea of legal votes and who is allowed to participate in the process. And importantly, you didn't speak to this exactly, but you spoke to the idea of defining what might be a legal vote. But I think it also merits some discussion perhaps of who gets to define what is illegal, and how there may also be points of privilege that come to bear on who's doing the defining, not just who's doing the legal votes. In any case, this is more of a comment than a question, but let me just throw that at you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think there are two related issues there for me. I think one is there is a question of casting legitimacy on the election process. I cannot fully pinpoint why it is. I mean, I think we've seen fundraising emails that go out that say, help us recount the vote. But there are these disclaimers on these fundraising emails that say, and X percentage of this is going to go towards our legal defense fund after, right? So there's this is almost like a backdoor way of fundraising, right? Because one of the best ways to fundraise is in a conflict situation. So you generate this conflict around voting and whose vote counts. But the ways in which whose vote counts to me is what is concerning. So the two senators from Georgia wrote to their Secretary of State, and basically, I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically said you counted black people's votes and you shouldn't have done that. Right? And so already there is a challenge there that is racially based uh, to whose vote gets to count. In Pennsylvania, the appeal is all the votes should be thrown out because the people who voted on election day were disenfranchised. Well, we know that most of the people who voted prior to election day were not white, just because of the demographics of Pennsylvania and the way in which the party breakdown works, right? And so, again, it's not as explicit as the case in Georgia, but Pennsylvania, too, has a racialized overtone to it as to whose vote should count. And so, if you can cast doubt on the election process in the short term, it means you're holding on to power, you're fundraising. But in the long term, this to me feels like creating footholds to make an argument to the Supreme Court. And again, I'm not sure it will happen this cycle because the vote counts are too high. And I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not seeing any true legal challenges come forward at this point. But it feels that it's laying the footholds to come to an originalist reading of the Constitution that says these are the peoples whose votes should count. And it fits in the trajectory of the logic of the Republican Party for the last several election cycles, which is disenfranchising as many people as possible, what has become known as voter suppression, which I think are two different but related ideas, coming into play. So I don't know if that gets to your comment, Professor Victor, but those were the thoughts that came to mind in your statement.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's going to take us a while to piece through some of what's happening. You know, when you're living in the middle of these big transitions and these sort of threatening moments or scary moments in democratic transitions, it can be a bit hard to analyze in the moment. We may need to wait for some historical perspective or to at least get out of the moment before we can truly understand it better. But one of the things you've talked about in your response there and in your talk today that we've talked about a lot in my class is an observation that at the founding of the United States, it was articulated as more of an aspirational democracy. And there seems to be some evidence that even the founders at the time sort of understood that. They understood that they were expressing some values about democracy that they were not themselves, in fact, practicing. And there is something a little bit hopeful about that to me, that maybe the foundations, while ill-conceived in practice, may have been more rightly conceived in terms of their theory or in idea.
Yeah.
And in my class, one of the things we've discussed or observed is this pattern throughout U.S. history, where periods of expansion of democracy, small d democracy, are often or expansion of rights, are often followed by periods of racial backlash, right? So after the Civil War and Reconstruction, we had the Jim Crow era. After the Civil Rights Movement, we moved towards this Southern strategy, more minoritarian government strategy that Nixon first articulated that is now being fully embodied in the Trump administration's strategy. So help us think about 2020 with respect to that observation and whether or not this tension between the promise of what democracy could be and how our efforts to expand civil rights are often met with anti-democratic backlash. It can't, are they incompatible? Like, how do we build a democracy that is racially just and stays that way? History has not shown our ability to do that. And is that what we should use to form our expectations in the future, you think?
It's such a layered, as I'm sure you know, I mean, you're teaching a whole class on this, but it is such a layered problem because there are these backlashes, right? And we see this Muslims are hated just like Catholics were hated, just like Jews were hated, and it presupposes that hatred of Jews has stopped, which it hasn't. Hatred of Catholics has stopped, which it hasn't. And it assumes that it becomes a rite of passage or part of our normal history, rather than saying, well, no, we can make this mistake once. When we do it over and over again, we're not actually learning, we're not actually progressing, we're stuck in the same cycle. It just looks different every cycle. I do believe that as a nation collectively, when we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. And I think what we look at polling across the board, questions of equity, of equitable distribution of wealth, of equality under the law, regardless of racial identity, of gender identity, of sexual identity, all of these poll very well. People want these things, but as you said, there are these anti-democratic processes, and what it has to do is, for me personally, I think it goes back to the our inability. So I'm gonna talk theology for a second. In Muslim theology, there's this notion of toba meaning repentance. In Hebrew, it's cognate with teshuvah, and it literally means turning away from something. So if I've wronged you, if I speak over you, I can ask for forgiveness. It was an accident. It might happen again, but there was no intention to hurt you on my part. One of these things that happens. If I'm constantly talking over you and ignoring you, right, then I'm doing something wrong to hurt you. And so repentance is not me seeking forgiveness, but is me saying I'm sorry and turning away from it and doing something else. And it seems like as a nation, we've been in the mode of forgiveness for almost 280 years, but we've never been in the mode of repentance to admit what it took to found this nation and the cost to Native Americans, what it cost to build this nation and the cost to enslaved peoples, and the questions of reparations. I know reparations sets off all sorts of people, but we think we already know what reparations are going to be, but we haven't faced the reality of the things that need reparations and restitutions in the first place. We need to name and identify what it is we as a nation have done. And I say this as somebody whose parents came here in the 1970s, right? I was born here and I had nothing to do with slavery, literally. And yet I know by virtue of being of Asian descent and racial laddering in this country, I am benefiting from the structures of slavery, the structures of Jim Crow that make me become the quote unquote model minority, again, defining myself and my community against black communities in this country, so that I am still profiting off these systems that have been established. And we need to have a reckoning with those first sins in order to then break these cycles and break these hierarchies, because that's when you start breaking the anti-democratic processes. Because right now we're turning a blind eye to the very issues that are embedded in the founding of the nation that allow these anti-democratic cancers to continue to survive within our body politic.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many follow-up questions that I want to tug on as a result of this discourse. But I really am respectful of the time or cognizant of the time, and I want to get some of these really excellent questions that have come in. So let me just try to field some of these at you and see how many we can get through. Charlie is asking for a little bit more detail about this Supreme Court cases regarding citizenship that you referenced. And are these still the sitting precedents, or have new citizenship precedents been set, he asks.
Thank you, Charlie. So in terms of Supreme Court precedents, I do not believe, and I again, not a legal scholar, so it is quite possible that there is relevant case law, but usually these two are held up as the ways in which whiteness and citizenship are linked. What changed was at the legislative level who was eligible for citizenship, thereby mooting the Supreme Court decisions. But as to the best of my knowledge, there's not overriding Supreme Court cases on this. Again, I'm happy to be wrong. I'm not a legal scholar, but that is my understanding of the situation now.
Yeah, it always, some of these things just blew me away when you look at when, for example, Native Americans fully came into legal citizenship status in the 1940s in the United States. I mean, it took an act of Congress to truly establish voting rights for African Americans, despite the fact that 100 years earlier we had a constitutional amendment. Somehow we needed a law to supersede the Constitution to actually achieve those voting rights. And that's just a function of the historical context. Okay, we have another question here from Hale, who is asking about, this is a wonderful presentation. Are you afraid to articulate that people have internalized a wrong sense of race? In other words, they have internalized what you have referred to as imagined citizenship.
I'm not quite sure I fully get the question, but I do think that within the context of the United States, questions of race are dominant, whether we talk about it or not. It is how so much of our society is structured. And intuitively, I think people buy into where they see themselves in the hierarchy. The feelings of anti-blackness in this country are palpable, and you know that you can get ahead as long as you define yourself as not black. Mary Waters, who's a sociologist over at Harvard, and I can't remember the book. Somebody on the chat may remember, but where she talks about African immigrants to New York, said we're trying to move themselves up in terms of social capital in their industries by saying we're African, we're not African American, right? So that it's this idea that black people in the United States are particularly a certain way, and that you can define yourselves up the racial ladder by defining yourselves against them. And I think people internalize that regardless of where they're from, how long they've been here, because that's how they see people getting ahead. I mean, Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing was talking about this, 35 years ago, 40 years ago now? I don't even want to think about how long that movie came out, but yeah. But it's still, I mean, this is part of the discourse for a while. And so I think that internalization of racial identity and this idea of buying into whiteness, again, not as a phenotypic category, but as a power category, is something that the US society is structured for and people buy into very easily.
Yeah, so that makes a really nice transition to Andrew's question, who observes that he's picking up hints of critical race theory in your presentation, and he's wondering if you could expand a bit on how Muslim American political participation might be interpreted through the lens of critical race theory, especially with respect to perceptions of whiteness in the Muslim community.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will, before I continue, because there's no way I can do this topic justice, I will shout out, or I will specifically mention Sylvia Chan Malick's book, Becoming Muslim, which does critical race theory and religion and gender is just phenomenal. It came out last year, I think, maybe earlier this year. It feels like all the days have blurred together, but it's a very recent book. And the work of Muslim ARC, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, which does a lot of work in this space as well, intersecting theory and practical work on questions of race and religion in this country. I think that when you look at whiteness in the Muslim community, I think that Muslims are racialized, right? That's what Islamophobia does. It treats Muslims as a racial category, but often a brown racial category. So even though Black Muslims are the largest racial grouping of Muslims in this country, they are not the Muslim that we imagine. The Muslim we imagine is somebody who looks like me, somebody with brown skin, South Asian Arab descent. And we find Sikhs and Hindus bearing the brunt of that, or Arab Christians and Arab Jews bearing the brunt of that, because the community is racialized. White Muslims are given a pass because they're not seen as part of that other body. So Muslims themselves are racialized and can be seen as a racial grouping. But I think that when we start looking at racial groups within the American Muslim community, they're no different than other racial groups in the American Muslim context. So again, that's why I try to separate South Asian and Arab immigrants from African American Muslims, because I think the ways in which they see themselves in the American racial hierarchy are very different. And sociologically, the ethnic component overrides the religious component. And so that's the way I would see that playing out, if I've understood your question correctly.
Yeah, I don't mean to skip around in the questions too much, just to apologize to those, but I'm trying to create a little bit of a thematic response to some of these issues that come up that are related to one another. And Miriam's question, I think, hits on one of these points that you've just been speaking about. She's talking about sort of a disbelief that Muslim majority countries where people of color are dominant ethnicities, barring Chechenians or Aryans, Caucasians, or other European Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
She's expressing some disbelief that some of these groups are claiming whiteness in the US context, even after 9/11. And
So, yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish your thought and then I'll.
Nope, that's it.
Okay. So, Mariam, thank you for the question. And I don't know necessarily if they're claiming whiteness. In other words, I don't know if people are necessarily coming out and saying we're white, but what they're saying is we are not those Muslims. We are not black people, right? So, again, it's defining yourself through negation. So, it's what Mahmoud Mamdani talks about, the good Muslim, bad Muslim. So we are the good Muslims. We are the economic drivers. Even now, as we're looking at the Pfizer vaccine, potential Pfizer vaccine, right? The whole story is, oh, look, these are these two good immigrants, these two Turkish people who started the partner company BioNTech. I don't know how to say it, but the partner organization with Pfizer. Uh, you know, and as far as I know, the founders haven't said this. This is how they're being described. That look, these are these good immigrants who've done this great thing for America. This is why we need immigrants. Well, the fact of the matter is, yes, I'm grateful if this pans out. I'm grateful for the work they've done and knowing how the scientific process works. Even if this doesn't pan out, I'm grateful for the work they've done. But their lives have value in an absolute sense, whether they had done this work or not, right? And I think that part of the rhetoric that gets brought up here is that your life only has value if we can monetize it, if we can quantify it in some way. And I think that what happens is this proximity to whiteness, Mariam, is not about claiming to be white, but saying, I am the type of person you want to be neighbors with. I have the good house. I have the good business. I don't befriend black people. Right? Again, anti blackness is an intrinsic part of this. And so that person is not saying I'm white, but what they're trying to do is move themselves into proximity to whiteness. Again, not the phenotypic category, not the physical category, but the power structures that allow them to be immune to the realities, the material realities that affect so many people in this country on questions of healthcare, living wages, housing costs, and so on. And Mariam, I'm assuming it's also you who's putting in all the links and references in the chat as well, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
One of the themes that's coming up in a number of questions here is something that I find myself trying to challenge in a lot of my public facing work as well, which is that there seems to be this very deeply ingrained belief, very reasonable, deeply ingrained belief that a lot of us have that our vote choice is determined by something about the issues going on in politics. How we feel about abortion or taxes or guns or healthcare or whatever. And that something very typical about how parties and politicians operate and their positions that they take on these issues should drive how we vote. And what people like you and me and a bunch of us are saying is that actually it's identities that are much more more heavily explanatory or predictive of vote choice than anything about issues. What can you say to help us remember that, to help that resonate? How do we either you and I as sort of public facing scholars or as the students in this class who are educated and go out and talk with their peers about politics, how do we either, there's a part of me that wants to say, how do we help people get it more right in terms of how they think about these things and what's causing it? But then there's also is it helpful? Is it helpful to try to convince people that it's identity driving these choices rather than preferences about policy issues? Why does it matter?
And I, why does it matter? I think that part of what's happened over generations is that policy issues have become identified with political parties and have really become formative for identity formation, right? And they're my colleagues in religious studies have really been working. I haven't seen anything come out yet, although I know people are working on it, that political party affiliation, particularly for the Republican Party, is a stronger predictor of behavior, of giving, of social cohesion than religious identity. Whereas it used to be religious identity used to be the category here. And that it is often done, it is much more and I'm using this term in ways that will irk my religious studies colleagues and actually irk me, but I don't have language for it yet, much more faith-based. And what do I mean by this? If you are interested seriously in reducing the number of abortions in this country, what we've discovered, we have data after data, decades of data on this, that it's actually not about criminalizing abortions. It's actually about providing sex education, access to contraceptives, and opportunities for women. All of these are probably the three most useful policy decisions you can make to reduce the number of abortions. The more informed an individual or a couple is about their choices, the more likely they are to avoid being in a situation where they need an abortion in the first place and have access and the means and opportunity to have access to the contraceptives that would do that. Now, what you see is in places that don't do this, those quote unquote pro life states, you have the highest percentage of abortions. It very clearly tracks. This is, again, this is no longer correlation, this is now causation. As somebody who works in or used to work in national security, in the national security area, the number of people who die, it was 2014, and I think it was true for 2015 as well, but I'd have to go back and double check. More people died, more US citizens died from falling IKEA furniture than anything related to terrorism connected to Muslims in non-combat situations. Okay, so leaving aside Iraq and Afghanistan. But where we have this threat, it's sort of this mosquito and shark idea. We are scared of the shark, even though mosquitoes kill far more people, right? And we as human beings are terrible at threat assessments. But if you want to be data driven, policy driven, as opposed to rhetoric driven, these are the things you need to look at. I don't know how you get people to listen to that when the narrative has already been established that only by criminalizing abortion can you reduce abortion, regardless of the fact whether that's true or not. Only by going after Muslims can you prevent terrorist attacks in the United States, even though the FBI has been saying for almost 2 decades now that the greatest domestic terror threat in this country are white nationalists. I don't know how you get people to listen to that data. The stories are already set and established. And I think this is something our colleagues in communications have been struggling with. We finally gotten a model where you no longer reinforce a lie. When a politician tells a lie, you tell the truth. You say what the person said is a lie, and then you say the truth again, right? The sandwich model of communicating information. But it's taken us nearly a decade to get to that model. So I don't know how you communicate with people who don't want to engage with data. Now we can, the Mark Twain quote, lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? You can argue that till you're blue in the face, and that I'm happy to do. But if the data is not even worth discussing because people don't care about the data, they care about their feelings only, that's where it becomes problematic.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid we have created more questions than we have generated answers in our time together today, but I take that as a good sign. I think this has been incredibly productive. And some of the conversation going on in the chat, I haven't been able to follow all of it, but it also seems like it's been positive and productive there, I think. Thank you so much for joining us. You've really given us a lot to think about. You're a wonderful presenter and a wonderful inspiration for our student population and our larger community here that came to listen to the presentation. So we really thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your perspective and your knowledge about all of this.
Thank you for hosting me.